Jonathan Blake, a 42-year-old successful architect, had always been the pillar of his suburban family. Born and raised in a small town in Indiana, he had moved to the city to chase his dreams and had met Laura Summers, a charming and ambitious journalist. They married at 28 and settled into a comfortable life in the suburbs with their two children, Emily and David. Jonathan prided himself on being a dedicated husband and father, working long hours to ensure his family's security and comfort. Laura, 10 years Jonathan's junior, had a vibrant and dynamic personality. Her career in journalism kept her busy, often leading her into circles of high society and influential figures. Although she initially loved the domestic life, she yearned for the excitement and recognition that came with her job. As time went on, the balance between her professional ambitions and her responsibilities at home began to strain. The cracks in their seemingly perfect life began to show when Jonathan received an anonymous tip. A series of photographs slipped under his office door, showing Laura in intimate moments with another man. Jonathan initially dismissed them as fabrications, but the details were too specific to ignore. Each photo told a story, one of clandestine meetings, stolen glances, and a betrayal that cut deep. Jonathan's confrontation with Laura was anything but calm. He found her in their living room, her eyes red from crying and her face a mask of guilt and denial. "Jonathan, please, let's talk about this," she pleaded, but her voice lacked conviction. Jonathan, with his heart pounding, threw the photos onto the coffee table. "Who is he, Laura? How long has this been going on?" His voice was steady, but the pain was evident in his eyes. Laura's tears flowed freely as she attempted to explain. "Jonathan, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. It started as a friendship, and then it just got out of control." Jonathan's world spun. The betrayal was not just in Laura's affair, but in the realization that the children he had raised with love and dedication might not be his biologically. The agony of this discovery was overwhelming. The once vibrant and loving relationship had soared into a toxic mixture of guilt, anger, and sorrow. It was during one of their most heated arguments that Jonathan stumbled upon another shattering truth. Laura, in a moment of frustration, revealed that David, their eldest child, had not been fathered by him. "David's real father. He's someone else," Laura confessed, her voice trembling. The revelation was like a dagger to Jonathan's heart. He staggered back, trying to process the enormity of the lie that had colored his entire relationship with his children. David, who was now 17, had always looked up to Jonathan as his father, and Emily, a sweet 14-year-old, had been the apple of his eye. The thought that these children were not biologically his was too much to bear. Desperate for answers, Jonathan demanded a paternity test. The results confirmed his worst fears. The children were indeed not his biological offspring. Jonathan's world collapsed under the weight of this revelation. The realization that the love and care he had invested in raising them were based on a lie was devastating. The house, once a warm and inviting sanctuary, became a battleground. Jonathan's trust was shattered, and his sense of identity was in pieces. He could not bear to face Laura, David, or Emily. The thought of remaining in a home filled with deception was unbearable. He decided to leave, not just physically but emotionally. One cold winter's evening, Jonathan packed a few belongings and left a brief note for Laura. It was devoid of sentiment, a simple declaration of his departure. "I can't stay here. This is not my home anymore. I need to leave." He did not explain his departure in detail, nor did he attempt to offer comfort to Laura or his children. Jonathan knew that any attempt to communicate further would only cause more pain and confusion. With a heavy heart, he walked away from the life he had built, leaving behind unanswered questions and an aching void. Jonathan's departure was sudden and dramatic. He vanished without a trace, cutting all ties with his past. He sought refuge in a remote town, far from the city he once called home. The new location offered anonymity and a chance to rebuild his life away from the shadows of his former existence. The pain of betrayal was deep, but he hoped that distance and time would eventually heal his wounds. Laura and the children were left to grapple with the aftermath. Laura's guilt weighed heavily on her, and David's anger simmered into resentment. The family dynamic was irrevocably altered. Jonathan's name was rarely mentioned, and the void he left behind became a silent, painful topic. Jonathan's disappearance created a vacuum in their lives. While Laura continued to struggle with her career and health issues, David and Emily faced their own challenges. David, now 22 and on the brink of adulthood, was particularly affected by the absence of the man he had believed to be his father. Emily, younger but perceptive, sensed the change but was too young to fully understand the gravity of the situation. As the years passed, Jonathan's past seemed to fade into obscurity. Yet, the echoes of his decisions continued to reverberate through Laura and the children's lives. The family struggled to adjust to their new reality, each person dealing with their pain in their own way. Little did Jonathan know that his decision to leave would set the stage for an unexpected confrontation years later. The choices he made in the wake of his betrayal were about to come full circle, bringing the past back to his doorstep in a way he could never have anticipated. 5 years had passed since Jonathan Blake had walked out of his old life, leaving behind the shattered remnants of his family. His new existence in the small, quiet town of Riverton was a stark contrast to the bustling city he had once known. The pace of life was slower here, and the townsfolk were friendly but largely unintrusive. Jonathan had managed to carve out a modest, peaceful life for himself, working as a freelance architect and living in a quaint cottage on the outskirts of town. In Riverton, Jonathan found solace in his solitude. He occupied his days with his work and occasional visits to the local diner, where he maintained a low profile. The pain of his past was a constant shadow, but the distance provided him with a semblance of peace. The scars from the betrayal had faded into a dull ache, and he had worked hard to build a new sense of normalcy. One crisp autumn evening, Jonathan was preparing dinner in his modest kitchen when a knock on the door jolted him from his thoughts. It was unusual for anyone to visit him unannounced, and his heart raced with curiosity and a hint of apprehension. He wiped his hands on a towel and walked to the door, his mind racing with possibilities. When he opened the door, he was greeted by a young man with a scowl on his face. David, now 22, stood on the doorstep, his features a mix of anger and hurt. His once boyish face had matured into a determined, almost hostile expression. David's eyes, which had once looked up to Jonathan with admiration, now bore a deep-seated resentment. "Jonathan Blake?" David asked, his voice tinged with bitterness. Jonathan nodded, his heart sinking as he recognized the young man. He hadn't seen David since his departure, and the sight of him brought back a flood of memories, some painful, some cherished. David didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed past Jonathan and entered the house, his frustration palpable. "I came here because I have questions," David declared, his tone brimming with anger. "You abandoned us, and now you owe us." Jonathan's mind raced as he closed the door behind David. "What do you want, David?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite the turmoil inside him. David's eyes were fierce. "I need money for college. Mom's sick, terminally ill. She can't work anymore. We've been struggling, and I came here to get what's rightfully ours. You left us with nothing." The accusation stung. Jonathan had anticipated that his past might catch up with him someday, but he had never imagined such a direct confrontation. He had tried to move on, to let go of the past, but here it was, crashing back into his life with a vengeance. David continued, "I don't understand how you could just walk away like that. You were supposed to be my father. You raised me, loved me, and then you just vanished. How could you do that?" Jonathan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The emotions swirling inside him were intense, but he knew he had to remain composed. "David, I understand that you're angry. I left because I couldn't stay in that situation. The lies and betrayal were too much for me to handle. David's face reddened with anger. So what? You just left us to fend for ourselves. You think that's okay? Jonathan didn't have a good answer. He had made a decision, one that he had believed was necessary for his own survival, but it hadn't accounted for the pain it would cause his children. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small envelope, his hands trembling slightly. "Take this," Jonathan said, handing the envelope to David. "It contains the paternity test results. They'll show that I'm not your biological father." David took the envelope with a puzzled look. "What is this?" "It's the truth," Jonathan replied. "All the questions you have about who your real father is, or why I left, you need to ask your mother. She's the one who has the answers." David's expression changed from anger to confusion. He looked at the envelope and then back at Jonathan, the gravity of the situation dawning on him. "Why are you giving me this now? After all these years?" Jonathan's voice was steady but laced with a hint of sorrow. "Because it's time you knew the full truth. I can't provide the answers you're looking for. I made my choice, and now it's up to you to find the answers on your own." David's eyes filled with tears of frustration. "I came here hoping to get some help, to understand why you left, and now you're just pushing me away." Jonathan's heart ached at the sight of David's tears, but he knew that he couldn't provide the emotional closure that David was seeking. "I'm not pushing you away. I'm giving you the tools to find out what you need to know. I can't be part of your life anymore." David stared at the envelope, the weight of Jonathan's words sinking in. He was no longer just a victim of abandonment. He was now faced with the harsh reality of his family's fractured past. "So that's it?" he asked, his voice breaking. "You just want to wash your hands of everything?" Jonathan nodded, his eyes meeting David's with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "I have to move on with my life, and you have to find your own path. I can't be the person you need me to be." David stood there, his anger giving way to a profound sense of disillusionment. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the house, leaving Jonathan standing in the doorway, feeling the full weight of his decisions. Jonathan closed the door slowly, his hands shaking. The confrontation had been difficult and painful, but he knew it was necessary. He had hoped that David would find the answers he needed and come to terms with the past. As he walked back into his quiet home, he wondered what the future held for both of them. David, meanwhile, walked away from the house, the envelope clutched tightly in his hand. He was unsure of where to go next or how to face his mother with the truth Jonathan had revealed. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the past had not yet finished unraveling, and the road to understanding would be long and fraught with emotional turmoil. The chapter ended with Jonathan staring out of his window, the distant figure of David growing smaller as he walked away. Jonathan's heart was heavy with the knowledge that, despite his efforts to escape the past, it had caught up with him in the most unexpected way. As he turned away from the window, he felt a deep sense of resignation, knowing that the future would bring new challenges and unresolved questions. David's confrontation with Jonathan left him reeling. The cold, hard truth of his parentage had shattered his world. The envelope containing the paternity test results felt like a weight around his neck. He clutched it tightly as he walked away from Jonathan's house, the cool autumn air biting at his skin. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, confusion, and a deep-seated sorrow. He made his way back to the city, a journey that felt interminable. The drive was a blur, punctuated by moments of introspection and frustration. The knowledge that the man he had called his father for 2 decades was not biologically related to him was overwhelming. David had always felt a sense of disconnect from his mother's family, but he had never imagined that Jonathan wasn't his real father. Upon arriving home, David found his mother, Laura, sitting alone in the living room. Her health had deteriorated significantly over the past year, leaving her frail and visibly exhausted. The terminal illness that had been a dark cloud over their lives had progressed, and Laura's once vibrant presence was now diminished. The sight of her weakened state filled David with a mix of anger and guilt. Laura looked up as David entered, her eyes widening with a mixture of surprise and concern. "David, you're back early. Did you find him?" David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he dropped the envelope on the coffee table, his hands shaking. "I found him," he said, his voice strained. He's not my father." Laura's face went pale as she realized the gravity of David's words. She reached for the envelope, her hands trembling. "What do you mean, David?" David's frustration boiled over. "Jonathan gave me this," he said, pointing to the envelope. "He said it has the paternity test results. I'm not his biological son. How could you keep this from me? How could you lie to us all these years?" Laura's eyes filled with tears as she took the envelope and opened it. The results confirmed what Jonathan had said. David was not his biological child. Laura's face crumpled as she processed the reality of the situation. "David, I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you." David's anger was palpable. "Didn't want to hurt me. You've been lying to me my whole life. You let me believe something that wasn't true. And now, when I come to you for help, all I get is more lies." Laura's voice was choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry, David. I didn't know how to face this myself. I was afraid of losing you, of losing everything." David's heart ached at his mother's words, but his anger was still raw. "You should have told me the truth. I deserve to know who my real father is. Instead, you left me in the dark, and now I feel like everything I believed in was a lie." Laura's tears flowed freely as she struggled to explain. "David, the affair, it was with a wealthy man who left us when he found out I was pregnant. I tried to keep our family together, to protect you and Emily. Jonathan agreed to raise you as his own because he loved us. He was a good man who did not deserve what happened." David's frustration turned into a deep sense of betrayal. "So, who is my real father? Where is he now?" Laura shook her head, unable to provide any further answers. "I don't know. He disappeared after I had you. I've tried to find him, but he's gone." The conversation left David feeling hollow. The search for answers had only led him to more questions. He felt as though his entire identity had been stripped away, leaving him vulnerable and disoriented. The anger he felt towards Jonathan was now tempered by the realization that his mother had been hiding her own secrets. As the evening wore on, Laura's health took a turn for the worse. The strain of the confrontation and her ongoing illness left her exhausted. David, despite his anger, stayed by her side, attempting to offer some comfort. Their relationship, though strained, was still bound by love and a shared history. The next morning, David found himself at a crossroads. He knew he had to confront his past and find out more about his biological father, but he also needed to come to terms with his relationship with Laura. The pain of the revelations was still fresh, and the uncertainty of the future loomed large. Determined to seek closure, David began investigating his biological father's identity. He hired a private investigator to help him trace any leads. The process was slow and filled with frustration, but David was driven by a need for answers. Weeks passed, and the private investigator finally uncovered a lead. David's biological father, a man named Richard Miller, had indeed disappeared from the public eye. However, the investigator managed to find a few clues about Richard's past and his possible whereabouts. It appeared that Richard had left the city and moved to a remote area, living under a different name. David decided to follow the lead and traveled to the remote location. The journey was arduous, both physically and emotionally. As he arrived at the address provided by the investigator, he was filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The small, secluded house was a far cry from the bustling city life he was accustomed to. When David knocked on the door, a middle-aged man with weary eyes answered. Richard Miller looked at David with a mixture of surprise and recognition. David introduced himself and explained the situation, including the revelations about his paternity. Richard's reaction was a mix of guilt and resignation. He admitted to having been involved with Laura during a tumultuous period of his life and had left when he learned about her pregnancy. He had tried to distance himself from the past, but hearing David's story brought a flood of memories and regrets. Richard agreed to meet David and discuss their shared history. The conversation was emotionally charged as David learned more about his biological father's life and the circumstances that led to his departure. Richard expressed deep remorse for the pain his actions had caused and offered to help David in any way he could. Despite the emotional turmoil, David found some semblance of closure in meeting Richard. It was not the complete resolution he had hoped for, but it was a start. The encounter allowed David to understand the complexities of his family's past and to find some peace with his own identity. Returning home, David felt a mix of relief and melancholy. The search for answers had been a painful journey, but it had also led him to a better understanding of his past. He realized that while the past could not be changed, he could still shape his future. David decided to reach out to Jonathan, not to seek reconciliation, but to acknowledge the impact his departure had on everyone's lives. He sent a letter expressing his feelings and the journey he had undertaken to understand his true identity. Jonathan, now living in a modest house in Riverton, received the letter with a mix of sorrow and gratitude. It was a small but significant step towards healing. Laura's health continued to decline, and David remained by her side. Their relationship, though strained, was strengthened by the shared experience of confronting the past. David's presence brought some comfort to Laura in her final days, and they were able to find a measure of peace in their remaining time together.